As long as you are convinced you have never done anything, you can never do anything. Malcolm X. Welcome to the We Don't Believe You podcast series. Our mission is to neutralize and dispel the false narratives, negative images, and disparaging stereotypes that have been perpetuated about Black people through various media outlets for centuries. Each week, we will highlight stories of Black excellence, greatness, and success of the past, present, and future, all of which share one common trait. They chose not to believe the negative images or stereotypes that said they couldn't succeed, but instead achieved massive success in spite of them. And now, here's your host, Brian McCoy.
Peace, and welcome to the We Don't Believe You podcast series, where our mission is to dispel and to reverse the false negative narratives and negative stereotypes that have been perpetuated against Black people in this country for centuries. We do this by highlighting positive Black images of individuals who chose not to believe those false negative narratives or stereotypes, but instead chose to succeed in spite of them. Our next guest embodies this principle. After graduating from the University at Buffalo in Buffalo, New York, with a dual Bachelor's of Arts degree in Political Science and another Bachelor's of Arts degree in Legal Studies, he then earned a certificate in financial technology from the boot camp of Columbia University. He went on to become a law student at the University of Connecticut School of Law, where he's entering his third and final year. At UConn Law, he serves as the incoming IT and research editor of the Connecticut Journal of International Law. He's a board member of the Loisel Moot Court, a member of the Negotiations and Dispute Resolution Committee. He created and is president of the UConn Law Basketball Club, a member of the American Bar Association Judicial Clerkship Program, amongst a host of other roles he plays in addition to being a law student. And he's expecting his Juris Doctorate degree in May 2025. He's a law student, a mentor, a community advocate, a source of motivation and inspiration to many. Most importantly, despite all of his accomplishments and achievements to date, he's one of the most humble, down-to-earth, and cool individuals I've come across in my travels. Please welcome Mr. Joshua Maddox.
Thank you so much, Brian, for having me. I really appreciate those words. And I'm happy to, just get into this conversation and start talking about it.
All right. So first and foremost, I want to express my utmost respect and appreciation for you being such a positive Black image and for all you do to help uplift the community. Sure. So now that we know all that you've accomplished and achieved thus far, let's talk about how you got here. Where were you born and raised?
So I'm originally from Harlem, New York. I was raised there. I pretty much spent all of my life there up until college. College was really the first time that I stepped out of New York City. Went up to Buffalo, as you said, and had a pretty interesting experience up there. So
describe the Harlem that you grew up in.
So the Harlem I grew up in was sort of in a transitional stage. It's not necessarily the Harlem that a lot of people may know from the 90s and the early 2000s, where, you kind of had a lot of crime, a lot of violence. There was still a decent amount of crime, unfortunately, when I was growing up. But at that point in time, I think what was really sort of, I would say, plaguing the neighborhood was gentrification. Prices of things were just going up. Really, I sort of had that first awakening when I went to school and came back after my first year. My neighborhood looked completely different, and I didn't recognize it. I think I would say that's sort of like the main thing that kind of like stood out for me throughout my time in Harlem. But it was, it's a neighborhood like any other neighborhood, but sometimes there's stuff that goes on, things that happen. Unfortunately, crime, stuff like that might either affect you or your friends. For me, I was lucky enough to never be a victim of crime necessarily, but I did have friends who, they were stuck up, held up at gunpoint, stuff like that. Some people were jumped, but it's really kind of indicative of New York City in general at that point in time, at least the New York that I grew up in. It's really kind of like two New York cities, or two or three. You kind of start getting into it. So I think it was definitely very interesting growing up in Harlem at the time that I grew up in.
Would you say you grew up in would you consider it the hood, suburbs, mix?
I would say it's the hood. Depending on like how you describe the hood, if we're gonna put it into that kind of category, right? So like we spoke about before, like New York it's very block based. The basically, like, you might have two blocks that are right next to each other. One block might be a certain way where you're constantly seeing crime, constantly seeing something happening, whereas the other one is a little bit calmer. I would say my block was generally pretty calm. The thing about it is that because it was, I guess certain people felt as if the police wouldn't go down my block as much, so they would do other things like, selling drugs or doing drugs on my block. So that was something that I used to see a lot growing up. And then in like the surrounding area, this wasn't necessarily like in the heart of the crack epidemic. This is way after, but you still saw some of the remnants of it. You would see kind of really just a lot of people who were smoking crack, stuff like that. So growing up, I used to skate a lot, and there's this famous skate spot in Harlem, and it's called the Lenox Legends. Right there, I mean, they used to sell crack. It was weird because you would see the police officers, right down the block, but they wouldn't do anything about it. So it's kind of just something that became normal, something that, you would kind of just go about your day and you would see it 24/7. So I would say it's definitely drastically different from, say, like a suburban area. It was not the suburbs whatsoever. But it wasn't necessarily, like some places right now are really going through it in New York. And, there wasn't necessarily like a fear of a lot of gun violence. I wouldn't necessarily step out of my house and be worried that I might catch a stray bullet or anything like that. But unfortunately, there were still some events that happened throughout my time.
So, do you think that kind of normalized that for you, like the just kind of drugs, violence?
Yeah, it definitely normalized it for me. I can't remember. Like now that I'm in law school, now that I'm in other places, even like when I was in undergrad, certain things might happen and some people might react to it one way, and I would find myself kind of being overly calm, which is strange. So I'm working for, I was just a part of this clinic, the Criminal Defense Appellate Clinic, and we just went to visit our client the other day in prison. And in the visiting room right next to us, like there was somebody fighting, like you heard them basically like yell out some expletives and stuff like that. Words that if you're from New York, if they said, what's about to happen. And, like I kind of saw like my my coworkers and everyone like kind of like, shifting, squirming, kind of feeling a certain kind of like concern. But for me, there was just this like strange calmness. Like I've been here before, not in prison necessarily, but in high school, people were getting jumped almost every day. People were bringing like bottles and knives into school. We had metal detectors. Like you're walking into it, and it's basically like you almost feel like you're going into a prison every single day. So when you kind of grow up in environments like that, regardless of what your household is like necessarily, all of that stuff becomes just commonplace, So it's definitely not necessarily a good thing. You shouldn't have to grow up like that, but it's nice to be able to remain calm in situations that other people might become more flustered in. I would say it allows you to react better, to keep a clearer mind, which I think is very important in today's day and age.
So that's interesting. So in that realm, or from that perspective, kind of growing up how you did helps you from that perspective.
Yeah, I would say it does. I would definitely say it does.
So describe the household that you grew up in.
Yeah, so my household was me and my mother and my grandmother. Basically, raised by a single mom, and my mother was also raised by a single mom. So it was very interesting growing up. My mom, kind of played two roles. My dad, I wouldn't say he was absent, but he wasn't present, if that makes sense. He wasn't physically, around me for the majority of the time. There were some years where I would see him maybe like 2 or 3 times a year. He had moved out to California when I was around somewhere between 8 and 12. And so like the most that I would kind of do is we would speak birthdays, his birthday, holidays, stuff like that. He would generally come out for Thanksgiving. This was before my grandmother passed, unfortunately. After that, it became, everybody kind of, when the glue of the family passes away, things start to change afterwards. So I would say that was kind of what it was like on that side. But, with my mom, my grandmother, they did the best to kind of give me a normal, quote unquote, normal upbringing. But one of the things that I would say that they definitely made sure was just that I had a good head on my shoulders and didn't, come up with excuses for myself or my circumstances or anything like that. So, if I was struggling in school, if I was, finding some sort of reason to act out, that type of stuff was nipped in the bud immediately, as soon as possible, because that's not how they wanted me to be. That's not the mindset that they wanted me to have. And there was never this concept of like, I'm going to blame your father for all the issues that we have. That was never a thing. It was always just, didn't work out between the two of them in a relationship, but, like your father will be the man that he wants to be. I'm going to be your mom. And that's, kind of what it was. So she tried to play, I'm not going to say she tried to play both roles, but she did her best to instill in me, I guess, some of the things that may have been missing from not having a father physically present. And she did, the best that she could.
So I think, I know, or we know that typically that's something that we deal with in the black community is the father not being in the household. And I guess it affects everyone differently. In what ways do you feel like not having your father in your household affected or impacted you or your perspective on life?
That's a good question. So, I think growing up as a younger man, or really a boy, I struggled with defining like exactly what manhood was. I think I got a lot of that from the media at that point in time, at that young age. So growing up, I used to love like old like 80s, 90s movies, stuff like that. And, stuff that like I knew I could go and talk to my dad about at some point in time. And if he kind of gave like a cosign, then I would look at it and say, okay, like this is something that I should, embody, or that this is the way I should view life. One of his favorite things was The Godfather, excuse me. So he would emphasize like the importance of family. So I think seeing how he was capable of sort of pulling out these like important themes from these sources of media became something that I figured I should implement in my own life. So I think one of the things that's sort of maybe different about my situation from some other folks' situation is that though he wasn't physically present, he would still, like get in contact with me and talk to me, and I would see him. Sometimes I would go out to California and spend the summer with him, even if it wasn't, super frequently. But one of the things that he kind of tried to always make sure to do was to instill some sort of wisdom in me, whether that be, putting me onto some kind of philosophy or history or whatever. Providing me, a roadmap of kind of like how to address some of the issues with life, whether that be personal, external, internal, whatever. So one of the things that he told me to read was Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. So I read that in college, and I think for me, around that time or maybe a little before then, I really started to realize, like my father's a human, my mom's a human. They are, they were young when they had me. They weren't, that young, but they were definitely younger. They were around my age, a little bit younger. And, I kind of just think about like my own mentality and what it'd be like raising a child at this age or really at a much younger age. And I don't think I would be amazing at it at this point in time in my life. So I'm not gonna, sit here and bash my parents for, maybe not being like perfect parents or anything like that. But they didn't have all the role models that they needed either. So my mom, she also grew up without her father in the household, but with him, she had zero contact, zero communication with him whatsoever. It was basically like she didn't know who her father was. I think I just got like the first picture of my grandfather last year, on my mom's side. It was the first time I even like saw him. Found out that she's got, siblings and cousins and stuff like that, but she's never spoken to them in all her life. And, we just found out about it. So there's this whole, other side, but that's the kind of trauma that she's carrying with her when it comes to, teaching me manhood and stuff like that. But she's, I think, done a very good job of making sure that she doesn't take that and say, oh, like, he's not doing what he needs to do. Like, basically just like any sort of misplaced aggression or anger or anything like that. There isn't any of that. And I think that that's something that's been very important in my upbringing, because it's allowed me to be myself and not purely define my existence based off of trauma that I've experienced or that my parents have experienced.
Interesting. So the relationship was there, he just wasn't physically present.
Right, exactly. The relationship was there, just wasn't physically present. So still would call him, still would chop it up and talk about really anything. A lot of philosophy and business and geopolitics, kind of like the main sort of discussions that we have. I think as I was younger, or when I was younger, it might have been a little bit more difficult, just because, talking to a child is different from talking to a young adult. But as I've, grown into being obviously just older, wiser, whatever, hopefully wiser, I think it's been easier for him to have certain conversations with me that maybe he felt like he couldn't have when I was younger.
And you thrived through it all anyway.
I tried to.
Was education something that was emphasized in your household, or was it just you were just raised a certain way and you know what to do and you went out and did it? Or was it stressed?
Education was stressed in my household. My mom, from like the day I was born, she was whispering in my ear, I'm going to college. So I really kind of had no other option. There was a point in time when I was in high school, my mom told me, either you go to college at 18 or you're going to get kicked out the house. So I was like, okay, I guess I'm going to go to college.
Go to college.
Yeah, I don't want to get kicked out the house. So it was definitely something that was stressed. I think it wasn't necessarily like you're going to go and become a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer or something like that. It wasn't necessarily that like, professions were stressed, but I think based off of like the understanding that she had, she went to college. My grandmother started college, but she didn't get to finish it. So this was something that was sort of like passed on down. Like even my great grandmother, I believe, I think she either wanted to go to college, or she kind of like really started to plant those seeds, I think, in her kids, and it's basically just been passed down since then. So education, regardless of whether it's like you're going to go and become a doctor or anything like that, is incredibly important. And it's mainly just so that you kind of know what's going on in the world, and you know how to protect yourself and to survive. That was sort of like the main thing. I think for me though, like I've really spent a lot of time thinking about like what's really important about education. I grew up down the block from Mosque Number 7, Malcolm X's mosque. So, talking about how knowledge is power, that was always something that was stressed in the household. How it's something that basically, if you don't know your history, if you don't know anything, then you will easily be manipulated, made a fool of, what have you. And that's just not something that they wanted for me. So they made sure that, education was something that, even if I didn't know it at that point in time, was something that would always be important to me. So one of the things my grandmother always does, she will buy me a book and just give it to me. She'll say, you don't have to read it now, but, when you have your library, just make sure that you, take some of these books down and read them, understand the world and the history that you are a part of, and just never stop learning. That's incredibly important in this world, to never stop learning.
So did you find yourself reading any of the books, or you still have them and you'll get around to them?
A little of both. I have a pretty large library. Sometimes when people come over, my generation isn't real big on reading, if I'm being honest. So people are kind of surprised when they see it, especially given like some of the other things that I'm into. It's like, oh wow, like you read books when you even have time to do that. But I love reading. Like I feel like, you can get a lot out of a documentary, you can get a lot of some videos here and there, but you won't get the same kind of like deep dive into a topic as you will if you actually sit down and read a book. So she's given me some that I've definitely read, and she's very big into religion and different aspects of it. So that's something that she's kind of opened my eyes up to a little bit more. She's a little bit more, I would say, like focused just on the church now, but before it was, I think, a little bit more open, and that's something I've always found very fascinating. So would love to kind of like dive into that area a little bit more. I think that that's something I'll probably be able to do after law school. But yeah, I've read some of the books.
Would you say you grew up rich, middle class, poor?
So we grew up middle class, like lower middle class. Definitely not poor. My grandmother kind of put in a lot of the work and laid a lot of like the foundation for where it is that we are now. She was able to get a good government job back, during the 60s when these were things that you could do with a high school education. And she basically stayed in that job and got the benefits that she needed all the way up until her retirement in like 2002. My mom, she worked at Columbia for a little while. That's a whole story. And she didn't end up leaving until like 2012, I think. And I think around that time, that was when we were kind of like straddling like lower middle class, not poverty, but closer to being poor. But at the same time, we had like the immense opportunity of actually being able to own our house, which it opens you up to a lot of other financial opportunities. If you can, if you have your house, you can, leverage credit against it, anything like that. So that was something that I think was very beneficial for us. But yeah, for the most part, middle class, lower middle class. But I'm an only child too, so things, were a little different for me than for other people who would have been in like the same area as me, just because I was the only person that they basically had to worry about at that point in time, other than my grandmother's foster children. So yeah, I would middle class, lower middle class.
So growing up in the household you did and where you did, what would you say are 3 lessons or values that you learned growing up that you've carried with you that still serve you well to this day?
One mouth but 2 ears. So listen more than you speak. And sometimes you need to pick your battles too. I think that was a very important one. And then obviously just the power of education, and knowing that you can always pursue new avenues, new opportunities, that it's never too late, I think is a big one. I think that all of those things have served me very well, but in particular, definitely the 2 ears and 1 mouth thing. Not sometimes you get people who just kind of like, they'll talk too much about certain things, and they are opening themselves up to potential attack or just problems that they don't need to have, because it's not even going to solve the issues that they are facing. So I would say that being more focused on action as opposed to talking, although at times it's definitely important to talk, and then to really like stand behind your convictions. When you know something is wrong, it's wrong. Don't allow fear or anything like that to deter you from holding that belief, even if it means that you don't talk about that belief at that point in time, and instead you pick your battle and find the right time to talk about it. I would say those are sort of like the foundations that I've taken with me from my upbringing.
Would you, or do you consider yourself to be just an inherently smart person?
No, not at all. Not at all. I struggled all throughout like high school, middle school, college, law school. Um, I just I think the main thing for me was figuring out how to learn, what the best way for me to learn was. I felt as if once I had gotten into college, I didn't really know how to do any of that. Um, and it took me a while to really figure that out. But before even getting to that part, I think one of like the best lessons I got out of high school was this concept of having a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. And that to me just kind of like was the light switch, that as long as you keep this mindset of I can learn anything as long as I try hard enough, I can do anything as long as I try hard enough, then that pretty much like gives you the key to open up all the doors, right? um, I know a lot of people that I've spoken to who have more fixed mindsets, even in law school, and they will hold themselves back because they don't think that they are, capable of doing something. Maybe, some folks have a predisposition to, being good writers or good orators, maybe some people are better at math than others, but I don't think that there's anything that, is out there that any individual can't learn. I think that we can all do whatever it is that we put our minds to. And I think that for me, that was sort of like the main thing. After that, I like finding shortcuts, maybe. I'm not sure if that's the best way to put it, but finding ways to either make my learning or apprehension of material happen faster. So for me, I've always been somebody who learns better by doing than by just, reading and internalizing. So, let's take something that maybe isn't the easiest to quote unquote do, like history or politics. So the way that I would learn something like that is I would, go and read some articles or whatever, or read whatever readings the professor gives me, and then try to apply it to what's happening in the world today, or talk to, friends, peers, whomever, and see what their perspective is on something. So I think that was something I always tried to do. And that was something I sort of started picking up in college. It's like my last year or two, I joined the Young Democrats, and I was also a member of BOSA. And so what I tried to do was really just like talk to people who had completely opposite perspectives as me, just because I thought it was interesting. I thought it was strange that, we could all be in the same country and have these completely different views on, to me, seemingly like easy issues. So like one of the things we were talking about were the statues of Confederate soldiers, Confederate generals, other statues just during the period of slavery that represent a very negative history. And, for these statues to be here kind of being glorified, to me, made no sense. So, when I spoke to some people who wanted to keep them up, I wanted to know why. Why is that something that you think needs to stay up? Especially since some of these people would be huge, like World War II buffs, and they would know that, the Nazis after World War II, like Germany had very strict laws in regards to, any of that iconography, Nazi iconography and all that. So it was just always strange to me that aside, and this is kind of like getting out of the scope of the question, but just it was strange to me that a side that literally tried to destroy the country gets promoted within the country actively. So that's one of the ways that I learned, is by putting myself in these sort of like maybe to some uncomfortable situations and applying what I believe I have learned in those situations.
Did you always like school?
No, no. I did not like school. But the reason I didn't like school isn't because I didn't like learning. It was because I felt as if the structure that they forced us to learn within was too rigid. I didn't learn the things that I wanted to learn. We didn't talk about, Black history nearly as much as I would have liked, either in middle school or high school or college. I think high school was probably like maybe the best time that I had. I was able to take AP US history, so that put me in a different mindset when it came to learning US history and to learning how this country works. But unfortunately, like when I would talk to my friends who were in the regular U.S. history class, they didn't enjoy it because they weren't talking about some of the stuff that we were talking about, which had a lot more to do with their own lived experiences, which I thought was interesting. So no, I didn't really like school that much growing up. I think I started to find more of a passion for it once I entered college, just because I realized, okay, like now I can kind of pick my own path of the things that I want to learn. And obviously, like going forward, it's just been a lot easier. But I would kind of like equate most of my schooling to almost like 1L, where you have like this rigid formula that you kind of have to follow. You got to take the same classes, taking the same tests, talking to the same professors. And maybe that's not what you want to get into, so not every class is going to be interesting. I think one of the ways I was kind of able to keep myself engaged was by finding how the different topics that I was learning connected to something that I actually was interested in. So, like I said, politics, geopolitics, even like art and history and stuff like that, all things that I'm very interested in. So I tried to do that during 1L. In middle school, that wasn't really something that I knew as much how to do. So I did struggle a lot in middle school. But that also kind of goes to the fact that I was in a predominantly white middle school. So there were a lot of other things that were going on that just kind of made it more difficult for me to actually focus purely on the learning. And then, there's a lot to be said about feeling like your teachers care about you or don't care about you. If you feel like they don't care about you, are you really going to want to try that hard for somebody who really doesn't care whether or not you succeed or fail? So that was something that it wasn't even necessarily like I had to learn it. I think I always knew that. I'm not going to say I always knew. I always had my mom, my father, my grandmother, like making sure to tell me that I was capable of doing these things. I just needed to sit and actually take time, focus on it. So I think that was very important, having that support system. Because the school wasn't really giving that to me. I had like one black teacher, two black teachers in middle school. High school was different. But I promise you, those two black teachers in middle school were my only mentors, the only people who were actually like really kind of like rooting for me and making sure that I actually did what it is that I needed to do and that I knew that I was capable. But everyone else, like, they might pretend, they might, try to show you that like they care, but I didn't really get that sense or that feeling. Maybe they were nice, but you could see how they treated some students differently than other students. I wish I had some sort of advice for people, in terms of how to deal with that. But it's difficult when you're a child. It's hard when you're a child. I would say the main thing is, as long as there's learning that's happening in the home itself, I think that's the most important thing. Actually understanding how history and how these different things can all come together to result in a strong and powerful education. And the same can be done with math, science, and technology as well. So I would say that's sort of my experience with that.
And that's interesting, and I'll ask you about it a little later on. But I actually think that dramatically impacts the black law students, black medical students, or the lack thereof, because if learning isn't made interested in it, if you don't feel as though you have the support, it's just as easy to not do it. It's just as easy to not pursue the education than it is to feel tortured going through it because you don't feel supported.
Exactly. And there's so much to be said too about just exposure, right? Because so many of the schools that we go to, you're not necessarily going to be exposed to the topics that you might find interesting. Had I been exposed to, I don't know, computer science or something like that in high school, like some of my roommates in college were, that might have been something that I might have pursued. Who knows, maybe I wouldn't be in law school right now, or maybe I would be in law school just with a computer science degree. So, these are all things that are very important to me. It's one of the reasons why I'm really focused on providing some sort of after school programming or something like that for kids that can expose them to new areas and to different areas of just all learning. I know there's this big push on science, technology, engineering, and math right now, and that's very important. But I think it's also important that kids are exposed to the importance of law, the importance of history, the importance of policy, you know, excuse me. These are all things that affect us day to day. Black folks more so, to be honest. So, that's sort of where I'm at.
What did you want to be? I guess your earliest memories. What did you want to be when you grew up?
So it's a little bit of like it's kind of like a roller coaster. So when I was a little kid, I wanted to be like I wanted to be a scientist, like a mad scientist, I guess. Um, I used to watch this show, Dexter's Laboratory, and he used to go to his room and he would have like this just gigantic laboratory that he would go into, just doing crazy experiments. So I'm like, oh yeah, that looks like fun. I want to do that. I want to create things and whatever. So that was the dream that I had back then, and it's sort of come full circle. Surprisingly, I feel like I'm kind of getting back into that. I want to invent things and build things, even if it's just in my free time, which is cool. But back then, going back to when I was a kid, after that, that sort of like faded, I think, as I got into middle school and started struggling with math and science. Although like there were signs of like having some sort of propensity to be successful in that, but it wasn't fostered like I wish it was. So I had gotten into playing football when I was about, I think, 7 years old. I played for the Abyssinian Crusaders up in Harlem. And then I'm like, all right, I want to be a football player. Like, this is fun. I love this. I was a huge Giants fan when I was a kid. The Giants had just won a Super Bowl. So I'm like, all right, yeah, I need to go be a wide receiver or a safety or something like that and make that dream happen. And so that, along with sneaker design, actually, because I'd also always been a sneakerhead ever since I saw my dad's closet growing up. He had mad shoes in there. So I'm like, all right, I like this. This is cool, So those two things were my driving kind of like force. Honestly, up until freshman year of college, I would say. Around like the end of high school, they start, kind of forcing you to pick a path that you want to go down. And after I had gotten into my school, I remember they sent us like some sort of like a form asking like, which major do you want to declare? I had no clue. I hadn't really spoken to many people about it, but like you can kind of see just how broad my interests are. Like I had always been into cars, always wanted to design cars or like, playing around with the customization options on different driving video games. So I figured, okay, clearly the path for me is to go down mechanical engineering, even though I had not taken calculus in high school. I had failed the trigonometry regents like almost every time. I think they just forced me to pass the last time I took it. I'm not really sure. Like I didn't necessarily have like the background to go down that path. And then once I started it in college, we had professors who were like savants or whatever. They didn't necessarily know how to teach. They were mostly there for research, it seemed like. So the people who who excelled in the class were the people who either had like a background in calculus already or, just kind of like knew how to study for these math topics in like the best way possible. That wasn't me at that point in time. I was also going through some personal stuff, some family stuff. So it was just a rough time that first year. So my earliest memory of what I wanted to be was an inventor. And I think it came back to that after I graduated college and I actually went and did the financial technology coding bootcamp, because then I realized, wow, the easiest way to build things right now is using software. So if I want to create some sort of program that, does something, what I was interested in at that point in time was creating a trading bot, then this is the best way for me to go about doing that. And really since then, I haven't really been coding as much as I want to, but I've been doing projects here and there, or just like kind of like brainstorming things that I want to do after graduating law school, so that I can kind of get back to my original primary interest, which was just building things, creating things. Whether or not it's some sort of like product or something like that, who knows? But I do think it's interesting to kind of see how everything's come full circle, and I'm back to that engineering mindset, even as a lawyer.
So ever since you could remember, it sounds like you've had some kind of drive or ambition. You kind of kept ambition.
I would say so. Yeah. I'm not sure where it came from, but I just always knew that. I mean, I must have came from my parents or something, but I always knew that I wanted to leave some sort of a legacy. That was always something that was very important to me. And so Jay-Z's album 444, he's got a song on there called Legacy, and that's just important to me. You know, like when I die, I want to know that I left the world a better place. I don't want to just, either take it and make it worse or take it and do nothing with it. Maybe it's selfish. I'm not sure, but legacy to me is very important, and I think that's the driving force behind a lot of my ambition. When I was young, I'm not really sure where I got that from. I think it was mostly it was the creative side of it. The creative side of building stuff was always very interesting to me. Since a young age, I'd always been somebody who used to, scribble, draw doodles and stuff like that. Did a lot of that all the way up into college. It's really only in law school that I stopped actually scribbling in my notebooks. Probably just because it takes so much focus. But that was, always something that's been very important to me is creativity. And I think those things kind of intertwine in some way, shape, or form to kind of lead to the ambition that I find myself having.
So ambition, in your opinion, is ambition inherent, something you're born with, or do you think it's instilled?
I think it's instilled. I don't think there's much that we're just inherently born with. I think that it's mostly what, especially as a child, you're told you can and can't do. I was never told that I can't do something. I used to, my mom used to tell me to do something. I'd be like, oh, I can't do it. She would say, I don't ever want to hear you say that word can't. You can do it.
No, it was instilled.
Exactly.
It was instilled.
It was instilled.
Yeah, no, that's beautiful. That's a beautiful story. Just a beautiful concept. So you attended university at Buffalo, in Buffalo, New York. What was the feeling, or describe the feeling of going from a predominantly black neighborhood and probably high school to a predominantly all-encompassing, predominantly white institution?
So it was a very interesting transition. So I had a reverse transition like that, going from my middle school to my high school, where I felt as if I was going from something that was, so my middle school was predominantly white, and wasn't amazing. Had some experiences that as a young person you don't necessarily want to have as a young person of color, but they really kind of showed me just like the world that we live in, and that all the stuff that my grandmother and other folks went through, it's not just left in the past. It gets carried on into today. And once I went to high school, I realized like, wow, like there's this huge welcoming community that exists within the world of education as well, and that's something that I want to surround myself with. So then going from high school to college, I really wanted to be in a place where it was big enough that I feel like I could kind of get like lost and just sort of like fade to the background. That was easy to do at Buffalo, given the fact that we were like 10% black or something like that. So, I didn't have my locks back then, so it wasn't like, you could easily point me out as, oh, that's the guy with the locks. Like, no, I had locks maybe for a little bit, and then it was short. But it was just easy to fade into the background. But, you become acutely aware of your race once you go to college as well. Not that I wasn't already. So around like the first few weeks that I was there, me and one of my other friends, we were walking around the campus, and we saw this bench that had a sign that said whites only on it. So like, what the, nah, like our eyes deceiving us? That's not real. So of course we get some food, and we sit down on the bench and we take a picture, because we're like, nah, this is crazy. Nobody's gonna tell us where we can and can't sit. Like, this is 2015. I'm not nobody's gonna tell me I can't sit here. I don't care where I am. So we thought it was real. We thought somebody actually, was coming through and putting these signs here and expecting that only white people would sit there. But it actually happened to be an art installation. And the artist, she came past and happened to be a black woman. And she was, I guess, talking to some other folks about like her purpose, her reason behind the benches. And I guess just sort of showing people that, this issue of race is not something that has just disappeared, right? Like there are some people out there who would like to see that sign on the bench and who would be perfectly happy with it being there. And to be completely honest, there's probably a decent amount of them who were in school with me at that point in time who were happy to see those benches there. So, that's something that was very pivotal in sort of like my it was a very pivotal first interaction for school. Around that same time, maybe like then or a year after, one of the other local schools in the area, Buffalo State, they had this situation where these little black like baby dolls were being left in like elevators. I think it either had like a noose around the neck or it had like a sign on it that said the N-word or something like that. It might have been both. But there was like actual like racial violence, you could say, that was happening at that point in time. And Buffalo is it's in New York. Some people think like, oh, New York is blue. New York is just like this big blue democratic progressive state. New York City is progressive. New York City is democratic. Some spots in upstate New York are also progressive and democratic, but when you get up into like farm country and like the suburbs, like it's not like that. It's red. It's all red pretty much. And the neighborhood that I lived in, when I would drive around, I used to see Trump Pence signs all the time. And like there were classmates who I would like literally have to have full blown like arguments with until I realized this is not a battle I need to fight about like the words that Trump would call people or the words that he would call countries. His past statements that he made about 5 innocent black men about how they needed to get the death penalty. People from my neighborhood, people who my friend's father grew up with. So, it was a very interesting time to be in school there. It was a very polarizing time. And I think it's so interesting because this was 8-9 years ago now. And not a lot has changed. A lot has become normalized, which is concerning. But it was a very interesting experience, to say the least, to be in a not only a PWI, but a PWI in a more rural / suburban area, just because you're going to get a much different mindset in a place like that. So it was interesting. It's taught me a lot. It's taught me how to perhaps like deal with certain types of mindsets or philosophies in a respectful way, so I don't find myself in some sort of confrontation I don't need to. Obviously, like, every black parent has the talk with their kid, and those were things that were always in the back of my mind. I don't want to become a statistic. I don't want anything like that to happen, which is why it can be important to really kind of pick and choose your battles. But that's sort of how it was. It was very eye-opening, I would say.
How do you think that it impacted you academically, or impacted your academic performance?
Yeah. So it definitely made it difficult. It made it hard to find people who were kind of like thinking the same way as me, or taking the same classes as me. Especially as I started moving more into like the political science area. What's interesting is, so like UB is a very big STEM school. They have a pretty decent political science program as well, but their focus is mostly STEM. And most of like the black students that I came across were in STEM fields. So as I moved away from STEM and got towards political science, I kind of stopped seeing as many black students as I wanted to. And so that made it difficult to kind of like study, talk about these issues with people. and really kind of like grow, which is why it was good for me to find like community in the Black Law Students Association pre-law chapter at UB, as well as the Black Students Association. So I was pretty active in those. I was definitely active in BOSA, and I actually competed in my first moot court competition in college, and that was through the Black Law Students Association. They held a pre-law moot court competition. So I would say in terms of like extracurriculars, it was good to be able to find that community. In terms of like my academics, my grades, and my classes, I had to really be a strong self-starter. So, I throw my headphones in, go to the library, and just sit there for hours, just working, reading, writing, and just consuming massive amounts of information about what's happening in the world, about what's happening in the law, wherever, just so that I would be able to apply, like I was saying before, those things that I was learning to what's happening in the world. Professors. So I'm laughing because I had a professor in this one class that I took, the Politics of the Civil War, who had us read this article about how the history of the world was over because great power conflict was no longer happening. You didn't see interstate wars happening as much or as frequently as they were in the past 80 years. But, me being Black, and I'd also had the amazing opportunity to go and study abroad in France, I was kind of seeing how there's this rise of like people who don't like Black people, how there was this rise of like fascists and alt-right, ideology. So I'm like, well, isn't it possible that like this rise in fascism or this rise in kind of like extremism and alt-right nationalism might result in some sort of a war? And he told me I was crazy. Maybe not crazy, but he definitely said, that's not going to happen. But then like 2 years later, Russia actually invaded Ukraine, although they had already been in Ukraine. And, the war kicked off. So, I don't know. I thought that was interesting. Now we've got what's happening in Israel and Palestine, which I definitely think is interesting. So, I would say there were a lot of experiences like that where I think my opinion maybe wasn't valued as much, just given who I am or how I might come off. And all my professors were white, pretty much. They were actually phasing out the African American program, so it was a rough period during that point in time. But again, you kind of walk away from all of these things with a lesson, which is mainly just, okay, like I know how to operate in this space now. I know how to make sure that people hear me and actually take what it is that I'm saying into account.
You graduated from the University of Buffalo with 2 degrees, so I'm slightly playing devil's advocate here, but wouldn't it have been easier to just go get 1? You could have gotten in, gotten out, no problem, half the work.
Yeah.
Why? What makes a person go and pursue 2 degrees?
That's a great question. I'm not sure why I did that. It definitely made all 4, or really the last 3 years, difficult. So the thing about me pursuing those 2 degrees, so like I said before, like I was mechanical engineering that first year, then like really kind of like left that after the first semester. The second semester I was kind of like floating around, figuring it out, thinking about maybe going into architecture or business or something like that. Realized I couldn't do architecture because it would require me to take an extra year of school, which I didn't want to do. Business, I took like some business classes, and I'm like, oh, this is really interesting, but I think I want to go down the politics route. So went and did that. I think at that point, by like the end of that first year, I had had enough to be in the legal studies program, which basically gave me access to anything that was like legal studies. So like, classes about like judicial decision making, constitutional law, stuff like that. I was able to take that at an earlier, basically before going to law school, to see if it was something that I actually wanted to do. But because I'm so interested in geopolitics, I wanted to also have access to political science and international relations in those classes. And those were my favorite classes. Just kind of like seeing how there are some similarities between what's going on in this country and in other countries was very interesting to me. So I was looking into like Yemen back in 2017, 2018, when they had, their famine and civil war and everything that's going on there. Looked into like, Bosnia, Herzegovina and Kosovo and, persecution of different groups of minorities in different areas of the world, which I really thought was interesting. Especially kind of like seeing people who, if they were to come to America, would be white Europeans, getting persecuted in other countries by white Europeans. So to me, it was interesting to see how sometimes it can really be like either class or religion that, turns into the delineator and makes it easier for certain populations to oppress other populations. But so because I was so interested in that area of education, I foolishly decided to go and pursue both degrees. I thought that it would give me, a stronger resume to get a nice job afterwards and doing something that I thought I was capable of doing. I actually had a really good GPA in both of those degrees. However, my overall GPA was a little messed up due to my first year bouncing around and being involved in mechanical engineering. But it was a little foolish, I had went and pursued my paralegal certificate through the legal studies program. So I had figured that with that, I would be qualified to be an actual paralegal, kind of like the ones I used to see in Suits, and actually do like real legal research, but it didn't happen. And I thought that was an incredible disservice because of the way that they marketed it as being this thing where, okay, once you get your certificate, you'll be able to graduate. And when you graduate, you will have access to all of these like well-paying jobs where you'll be able to research laws and cases, and you'll help attorneys on very important matters. But instead, I basically became an administrative assistant where I was kind of just booking rooms for people. So I know that you got to work up. You're not going to graduate and automatically get the job that you want right off the bat. And I think that was something I wasn't very aware of at that point in time. I think another thing I wasn't very aware of too was the fact that with the gig economy that I had kind of graduated into, they were always looking for a reason to either like fire you or get rid of you, and that definitely happened a few times, once or twice. But yeah, so I really thought it would actually make life a little bit easier, but it didn't, unfortunately.
I'm sure it. What is the word? What's the expression? Toughened your metal. It kind of, it created a situation where everything after that is fairly easy. Just a sense of confidence in knowing that you did above and beyond and you crushed it. So I'm sure that had a lot to do with a lot of things that happened for you in your life afterwards.
I would say so. I definitely think that it definitely did toughen my metal. I realized I could do more. I realized I could, really thrive under pressure, and I think that that's definitely helped in law school for sure.
So speaking of which, so you finish at you have your 2 bachelor's degrees, and you could have, with 2 bachelors, I'm sure could have found a job or a career and just started living life and getting paid and all of that kind of thing. What prompted a decision to go to law school after just finishing the rigorous academic program that you just did?
Yeah, so I had already sort of been interested in pursuing law since college, since around, like, literally probably the day Donald Trump was elected. I wanted to make some money before then, and I wanted to pursue some other options before then as well. So I went and did the financial technology boot camp, worked some jobs, got some experiences doing some pretty interesting stuff. Excuse me. But the whole time I knew that I wanted to have the tool of being a lawyer. Whether or not that means actually being and practicing as a lawyer, I'm not sure yet. But I knew that I wanted to be able to have that option. Should I ever need that. Also, too, just like going through the political science program, going through the legal studies program, and studying specifically the Constitution, I realized like how much of our rights are embodied in that, and how everybody needs to know the importance of their rights as well as just what they actually mean in practice. Working in this clinic I was just working in, one of the things that they say all the time is like, specifically when it comes to being questioned by the police, so many people don't realize that they don't have to be questioned by the police. So many people don't realize that they can just stop the questioning right then and there and say, I don't want to answer these questions, or I'm not talking without a lawyer or anything like that. But instead, what ends up happening is people don't know their rights, even after Miranda, being given their Miranda rights, just because the police oftentimes will try to coerce or persuade individuals to waive their rights because it makes their job easier if they get that waiver, and they can get a confession and then boom. So in the community that I'm from, that's something that's very important to me, making sure that people actually know the rights that they're given. And reading through the Constitution in college was something that showed me like, okay, we have rights. So as I was going through this sort of like transitional period between college and law school, I had always been studying for the LSAT and kind of just like getting on that track of grinding to get to school, but it wasn't until 2 years or a year before, maybe 2 years, that I really like sat down and said, okay, like this is something that I'm going to do. I'm going to have this consistent study schedule, and I'm going to make sure that I get into law school, and get into a good law school. And I, basically did a lot of research in terms of like what a lawyer can do, both like traditional and non-traditional jobs. And I realized that that's exactly what I want to do. I realized that having the ability to go and bring a case to court that deals with a certain right, and then making sure that that right is upheld, is an incredibly powerful gift to have. And
Sure.
I'm happy to be pursuing it regardless of the ups and downs that law school has inevitably brought.
Between a website and Juris and the American Bar Association's website, statistics say that black people represent anywhere between 6.34 to 9.08% of all law students in the country. So according to the ABA, or the American Bar Association, in 2022, there were roughly 1.3 million lawyers in the United States. And of that 1.3 million, roughly 4.5% were black. So, two-part question. First part, with so few black lawyers and law students in the country, what made you think that being a lawyer was in the realm of possibility for you?
So my mother's friend went to CUNY Law while I was in college. And watching her, I think, was one of the first instances that I realized this is something that is attainable for me. I can go and pursue this and become a lawyer. At the same time, being a member of the Black Law Students Pre-Law chapter at the University of Buffalo exposed me to other black students at Buffalo who were pursuing a law degree. And for me, that was also very foundational. It showed me that these are people who are around my age who are pursuing this and making it happen. I can do this. It's not something that was in my mind when I was in high school or when I was in middle school. I always liked to argue, not just for argument's sake, but I was always looking for the logical reasoning behind something, right? And that to most would maybe predispose me to being a lawyer, but I just didn't see black lawyers as a young person. as I kind of, started doing more research and learning more about the history of the Supreme Court, the history of Brown versus Board and other cases such as that, then I realized, like, oh, this is like really, really attainable. I remember I took this race in the American system class in college, and one of the movies he had us watch was about Thurgood Marshall and his path into the Supreme Court, but obviously before that, just his path as an activist litigator who was, securing desegregation for all black folks. And, I thought that was interesting, more so because, one, like, here's this black lawyer who's doing an amazing thing, but two, like, he's using the law to pursue a civil rights agenda, which I thought was very interesting. This is somebody who's, effectively a warrior. And, one of the things that I just learned in an interesting class I took last semester, cannabis law, our professor told us the meaning behind the word esquire, that it means shield bearer. And, here we had Thurgood Marshall basically acting as that for the black community by ensuring that our rights are protected and that we actually have them and they're real and not fake, like they had been as a result of cases before then. So I would say that all of those things kind of came together to show me that I could be a lawyer. But when I talk to like some of my friends, whether they be white or black, like I hear some of them talking about how they knew since they were a kid that they wanted to be a lawyer. That was definitely not my experience. Like, as I told you before, I was looking up to Dexter's Laboratory. That was what I wanted to be. But I didn't see black lawyers in TV shows, or I didn't have them in my family at that point in time. This wasn't something I was exposed to, so it took a while. It took seeing other people actually pursuing it to know that this was something that I could do.
So I'm guessing that that's going to what you just said is going to tie into the second part of the question is, why do you think that there are so, relative to the black population in America, why do you think that there are so few black lawyers and law students?
I think there's a few reasons behind that. I think, so, growing up, my grandmother was a foster parent. And the discussions that we would have generally had to do with the system, right? And the system uses the law as a way to keep down a lot of black people, unfortunately. And this is something that I think we see happening consistently, whether it be, Clarence Thomas rolling back certain areas of affirmative action back in like the 90s or late 90s. And then all the way up until today, where we have no affirmative action. We have no Roe v. Wade. We have, none of these different cases that established certain fundamental rights. So I think that this general understanding among black folks that the system is not for us is one of the reasons why I think a lot of folks don't pursue it. There's a saying that you can't take down the master's house with the master's tools. So I think that there's a little bit of that goes behind it. But I think more than anything, it's simply just the lack of access, seemingly the lack of access, not knowing what it means to be a lawyer, not seeing any lawyers who look like them. When you watch TV, movies, whatever, especially like criminal shows, the lawyer is white, the defendant is black. So there's almost like this consistent narrative or theme that our position isn't standing up in front of the judge, but it's sitting down shackled in front of the judge. So I think that unfortunately, like, there's just a lot that happens in media and within our own communities that shows us that this or tries to like instill the idea that this isn't a field for us. So I think the way to kind of like fix that would be to show kids and adults that this is something that we not only should but need to pursue. Which is why at the same time I'm also advocating for, like, it's not something I would necessarily do. I want to be a defense attorney, but I'm advocating for more black people to go and become prosecutors as well.
Prosecutors.
Because if we don't have black prosecutors, We don't have people who come from our experiences who can use their prosecutorial discretion to ensure that people aren't getting hefty sentences that they don't need, that communities aren't being destroyed by sentencing black folks disproportionately to every other race. So I think that that's one of the reasons why we don't see as many black folks in the position or in the profession as we need to see. But I think that in the future, one of the things that I want to do with UConn specifically is help them to establish a closer network with the community itself. There are some things that, might come in, or some considerations that some people higher up might make that to me makes no sense. But we're going to find a way regardless to get the community involved in UConn law, but then also just in law schools in general, and ensuring that kids know that they can go and pursue a law degree. I think Barack Obama was a pretty decent example for a lot of folks, just knowing that he went to Harvard Law and all these different things, and then went and became president. That's amazing, right? But I think that a lot of people still think that he's just kind of like a one-off circumstance. Like he's not necessarily the norm, but an exception. So I think once we make that the norm, I think that at least within our communities will be good. I think part of that too comes from the need for us in our communities to self-educate as well, and to have schools that teach our own and ensure that we're especially if they're going to take CRT out of schools, they're going to take all of that stuff out of schools, then we need to make sure that they're learning it somewhere. And not every kid is going to be able to learn it in the house, unfortunately. Maybe their parents aren't equipped to do that. So there needs to be some sort of like after school programs or something like that that gives them that foundational learning that they need to go and pursue professional schools, or just even other greater opportunities.
So it's because I was actually going to ask you another devil's advocate question. The country has been functioning for centuries with the same number or less black lawyers. Why do you need them? What's the importance of them? In other words, if it's not broke, why fix it?
So the country is broken. I think it works right now for a certain part of the population. I think that the other part of the population, the ones that we're a part of, it does not work for us whatsoever. It has been functioning for wealthy white individuals for centuries. It has been dysfunctional for black people, people of color, and even poor white people for the past 400 years as well. I think one of the hilarious things to me is, and I promise I'm gonna answer the question, is poor white people voting against their own interests consistently, purely for the fact that they can support a white supremacist, wealthy white man who will ensure that they can always feel proud to be white or whatever. But the black candidate most likely would have actually elevated their situation in life, because they're going to go and ensure that the different things that we as black folks need, because we've been held down by the system for so long, are actually in place to push us up. So I think that that's one of the things that I would point out. The country just has not been functioning whatsoever. I think that if we have more black people in professions, law, medical, technical, you're just going to see like better output in general, because you're going to have more diversity within those professions. So I'm going to point to technology for a second. When Tesla was designing their driverless automatic system, they trained their AI on, in terms of like facial recognition, they trained it on Congress people. Excuse me. But congressmen are overwhelmingly white and men. So what ended up happening was the cars would not recognize black women. this is something a black engineer would have picked up on as soon as they started picking their data sets. But because there's no black people there, you know, now you got black women getting hit by cars. Like, this is something that we need to address. You and I, when we were talking about this yesterday, we were talking about how the lack of doctors is making it difficult for black people, black men, to go and actually get diagnosed for forms of cancer that could be prevented earlier on. So now shifting towards, you know, the legal sector, when you don't have black lawyers who are there, you are going to lose an entire perspective that will advance society as a whole. And without that perspective, like, we're basically doomed to repeat the same issues over and over again. And frankly, a lack of black lawyers could even be seen as a national security issue. In 2016, when you know, Black Lives Matter, and either it was in 2016 or maybe 2018, it was might have even been right at the point of George Floyd during the last election. Russia, knowing that there's this massive divide in this country that's been present for the past 400 years, decided to use their technology, their troll farm, to create propaganda that played on race, on issues of race in America. So one of the things that they did was they literally used like some fake account to create a Black Lives Matter protest, and then they used another fake account to create a White Lives Matter protest, and they scheduled them to be right across the street at the same exact time. And it led to chaos, of course. So this is what happens when you don't have black people at the table, when they can't let the higher ups know that this is a bad idea, because you are not going to there are going to be black people who are adversely affected by this decision. Or let's say, you know, it's a lawyer talking to their client. Maybe a white lawyer isn't necessarily going to believe their client when their client wants to give them some information, but the black lawyer would be more likely to. And you can alleviate yourself of all of that friction if you just provide that black client with the black lawyer, or if you allow them to have the option to reach out and get a black lawyer. So many public defenders are white because they can afford to either take a pay cut if that's the case, which is why you end up having a lot of black lawyers going into corporate law or something like that, because they frankly they need the money, they need to support their families, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But even there in corporate law, we need to make sure that there are more black people sitting at the table so that black people have even a transactional chance. Because as of right now, we have nobody sitting in these positions. I mean, we're basically just doomed to keep running on this hamster wheel and not actually get anywhere.
Yeah, you're a smart dude, man. You never cease to amaze me with just your thoughts. Like, I've heard you say stuff in class, and I'm like, yeah, this guy's powerful, man. So these are kind of rapid fire questions, because I know I don't want to take up your whole day, but how do you define success?
That's a good question. So success is, I think success is something that's very personal in terms of defining it. For me, how I would define it is having the ability to give back and improve the community from which I came. That's something that's very important to me. Also having the ability to increase or improve my family, and to eventually one day become a father who can instill very important life lessons in their children and allow them to go and pursue whatever it is that they want to pursue, as long as they do so full with, you know, like, all of their intention. I think that's how I define success, yeah. And then also, it's like this everlasting journey. It doesn't necessarily end. I think success is never being complacent and always allowing yourself to pursue your dreams and to, you know, one day get there.
Failure. How does Joshua Maddox define failure?
I don't believe in failure. I'll be honest. I think every failure is a lesson. I think the only way that you can fail is if you fail to try. Kind of like going back to what my mother said. You know, if she doesn't want to hear me say can't, so everything is can. Everything is I can do this. I will do this. So I think that's really how I would look at failure. Even, you know, if I get my report card back and my grades aren't necessarily what I want, I can at least learn from that. I can think about what happened in the past semester where I'm like, okay, I didn't do this, or I studied this way. This didn't work. Maybe I can tweak it like this. If I'm looking at it like that, if I'm looking at it like a lesson, then I'm not allowing myself to slow my own growth down.
That's funny because I ask that question usually as a trick question, and not everybody answers that way. But yeah, no, that's my answer. That's my answer. So, what do you think? What do you think will take a person farther in life? Would you say just kind of sheer intelligence or solid work ethic?
Definitely solid work ethic. Making sure that you can sit down and get the work done is the most important thing. They say hard work beats talent if talent doesn't work hard. So that's number one. Like I said before, like I'm a pretty big sports fan. Maybe not as big in recent years due to law school, but big on basketball, big on football. And a lot of times you'll see guys come into the league who are maybe very talented. Maybe they were talented in college, talented all throughout high school, but once they get into that the big boys game, they're not putting in the same kind of work because they've been told that they were the greatest forever. And now they're struggling. They're not successful. I think people like, LeBron, Mike Tyson, Muhammad Ali, like those are dudes who, yeah, they know that they're great, but they keep working hard 24/7 to ensure that they stay great. And I think for anybody first of all, everybody should believe that they have talent. I'm not sure if everybody believes that. Everybody should believe that they are talented at whatever it is that they want to do. Once you get that into your mind, the main thing is just, I either need to stay talented or I need to get more talented. But me, in my mind, I'm always going to be looking for more. I'm always going to be looking to get more talented, more educated, be more wise, whatever. So I think that's the need for constant growth and having that growth mindset, I think, is what will get people far, really far.
In your opinion, what are 3 necessary ingredients to success in any endeavor?
I would say work ethic is definitely number 1. Number 2, I would say knowing that you don't have all of the answers and to keep people who are smarter than you around. Number 3, learning from others' mistakes is massive. And I think with those 3 things, you'll give yourself the best start possible without too many hiccups along the road.
So one thing I know for sure about successful, motivated, and driven individuals is that once they've gotten to the top of their chosen mountain or endeavor, they don't celebrate too long. They only get to the top because they're looking for the next mountain to climb. So my question for Mr. Joshua Maddox is, what's your next mountain?
What's my next mountain? I think my next mountain is figuring out how I can... So I'll be at the peak of this mountain at the graduation of law school, or really maybe the passing of the bar. Then I'll be at the peak of this mountain. The next peak that I'll be looking at is how can I use all of these tools to either create a business or some kind of project that will better both my family, my community, and myself. And really kind of start focusing on giving back in some way, shape, or form, while also trying to build some sort of like personal project for myself. I know one of the things that I want to do in the future is start a business. I think it might be some kind of like technology and legal cybersecurity business, maybe some consulting business or something like that. And the goal of that is to be focused on how those things intersect with race. So I think that'll be the next mountaintop, will be specifically maybe starting that business and actually getting that thing going.
I tell you, and I tell you and a handful of others that I think I speak for everyone when I tell you how extremely proud of you I am and how grateful I am for the icon and the image of Black excellence that you represent. It is really, really just, I'm grateful that the universe set it up so that our paths crossed in life. And I know I also speak for all of us when I tell you that I wish you all the best and continued success in all of your endeavors. But before I let you go, we have a segment of the show. It's called the Black Box, where we ask all guests to make a deposit of some wisdom, guidance, insight, encouragement, motivation to help uplift the black community or some segment thereof. So what could you or what would you like to deposit into the Black Box?
Okay. So I have a little something written down in preparation for this. So I'm going to just read it off real quick. So first thing I would say is learn to find comfort in uncomfortable situations. It's important to not allow oneself to become complacent. I gotta read my own handwriting. Make sure that you seek new opportunities and experiences, and to take yourself out of your comfort zone frequently, as you'll find that this is the place that you'll continue to learn. So the next is to always be learning. One thing that we all should learn is our history. Once you start with that history of your people, branch outwards, and you'll inevitably find themes across stories. Those who don't know their history are doomed to repeat it, which is why it's so imperative that we make sure that we know it. I once heard that a smart man learns from their mistakes, but a wise man learns from others' mistakes. So seek wisdom, and this is the power of mentorship. This mentorship leads me to my last point, which is with everything you do, always remember to give back.
That's beautiful, man. That's beautiful. Everybody, Mr. Joshua Maddox.
Thank you so much.
And that's a limited time only, because in another year or so, that'll be Joshua Maddox Esquire to you. So thank you sincerely. Thank you for your time, your energy today. And we look forward to hearing from you and seeing you again. And thank you for not believing the false negative narratives or stereotypes that have been perpetuated about black people for centuries. And thank you all for listening and watching. And if you too don't believe those false negative narratives or stereotypes about black people, and instead you choose to succeed in spite of them, please like, share, comment, subscribe, and let's make great things happen. Peace.
Peace.
Thanks for listening to the We Don't Believe You podcast with your host, Brian McCoy. We hope you feel enlightened and empowered by our show. Please visit our YouTube channel at We Don't Believe You and our socials at We Don't Believe You on Facebook and Nah Don't Believe You on Twitter X. Please subscribe and share our podcast. Peace.